Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. A young lady that I think very highly of, who's a very smart academic and writer for a think tank, has written an article that I found really provocative. Is Alberta oil ethical? Heather Exner-Pirot is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. She's an expert on oil and gas, on critical minerals, on Indigenous issues, etc. But Heather, welcome to the show. Is Alberta oil ethical? You said in your article, my piece for Alberta Views April issue, I argue that the stability and prosperity of the liberal world order, depends to no small extent on Canada being a significant exporter of oil. It would be unethical to stop producing it. Really?
Yeah, I honestly fundamentally believe that. And where to start for some of your audience members that are maybe more skeptical of all this? I always say this, back in the 90s when I started university, what white girls like me did when they went to university to save the world was international development. Now they do climate change, but still back in my days about international development. And that was my undergrad. And I spent time, in Latin America and Africa and in Geneva, working with world, NGOs. And that is still the lens that I view all these things is development and ending poverty. And I still think that's the most important thing, for human well-being and development. So, to get to oil is fundamental to our way of life, to civilization. We can't have 8 billion people without oil. We can't have 8 billion people without cheap energy. And oil provides that cheap energy. It's the biggest source of energy in the world. Fossil fuels are about 80%, and energy has the biggest share, and coal and natural gas follow that. So the things that we take for granted, globalization, food, modern agriculture, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, all those things come from oil, transportation, obviously. So we are getting close to having more demand than supply. We're getting very close to that. And we already saw, when oil went above $100 a barrel last year, what that looks like, how inflation spiked, how it affected the cost of everything. And we're getting close to that again. And so, yes, Alberta, out of the 100 barrels or so a day that the world produces, Alberta produces about 4.5 of that. We export about 3.5 of that. If we took that out of the mix, there would be an energy crisis.
So what's the implication? That you think that we should get rid of carbon taxes? We should give up on carbon sequestering? That we should not be worried about oil and gas and pollution and climate change?
No, the opposite, I think, is that we should invest more in carbon sequestration. So out of that mix, this is the history of the world that people often miss. We have just come out of almost a decade of cheap energy. And people might remember there was a commodity spike, 2008, 2009, when oil went to 46 barrels briefly, dollars a barrel. And anyway, there was a big, commodities boom. And what ended that was the shale revolution, was cheap American shale. And they went from the world's biggest importer of oil to the world's biggest producer of oil, and just fundamentally changed global oil markets. And most of those shale producers did it at a loss. That until last year, until 2022, a lot of them were still in the red. They just produced so fast, so much, kind of wildcatting, that they forgot to make money for a while. Anyways, last year oil prices went up, they made some money. So oil prices were averaging, $60 a barrel, even less for the last few years. And what a great time that was for development, for getting people out of poverty, for all the things that cheap energy provides. And now we're not in that era anymore. Now shale oil is plateauing. In the next few years, it will start to decline. And the Americans won't be able to counteract, for example, OPEC, Russia, in stabilizing these oil markets. So the need for Canadian oil has maybe been muted because there was so much American shale. But once that American shale starts to decline, the role of Canadian oil is going to be very important. We are the only OECD country with oil reserves in the top 10. All the rest are OPEC producers.
Shale oil, is that not been very negative to the from a pollution standpoint? All the negative things we've heard about shale oil and controversy even in the United States about producing shale oil. What's the environmental impact of shale oil production?
So the way that the reason there was a shale revolution is because two new technologies unleashed all these hydrocarbons that have been sitting in these basins that beforehand weren't accessible, and that was hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling. So that was what made accessing these vast stores of hydrocarbons technically possible and also economic. And so people were very, scared about fracking. That would get into water supply, that would cause earthquakes, all those small things. Anyways, we're 10, 15 years into it now of doing it really at scale. And those things haven't really come about. So, does oil exploration and drilling have an impact on the land? Yes, it does. Does everything have an impact on the land? Yes. 8 billion people can't survive on this earth without impact on the land. So I'm not trying to diminish it, but compared to other conventional types of oil, it's not much worse. And shale is quite light, so it's not particularly carbon intensive.
I understand we have some shale reserves in Canada that we're not exploiting. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this is what, the oil petroleum engineers will correct me. It's not shale in Canada. I think it's sandstone, limestone. It doesn't really matter. The process of extracting it is exactly the same. So it's in sediment. We can frack it now. The Montney, when I've spoken to you before about the Montney, Laird, the Horn, that is what we call unconventional. So shale is what we call unconventional. And yes, that is the same process. By the same processes, we are able to unleash those hydrocarbons also.
But we haven't approved it, have we?
It's approved. It's happening. Yeah, it happens. Because
Okay.
it's not like there's not, I think 10 years ago there was some fear mongering about fracking, but like I say, there's a lot of experience with it now, and kind of all the alarmism didn't play out.
But our oil is primarily bitumen, is it not? And from the oil sands. And I understand that that's high in its carbon intensity. And is that not a problem then?
Yes, absolutely. Its carbon intensity is a problem. So almost all of Canadian reserves, and again, we have the third largest reserves of oil in the world. Like I say, blessed with the third largest reserves and the most important commodity in human history. What a blessing. Third largest reserves, and it's mostly in the oil sands. And so that is, very heavy. It's bitumen, and you have to kind of melt the bitumen off the sand so that it can flow, so you can put it through a pipe. So it is carbon intensive to get it out, because you need heat to melt it off to produce it in something liquid. So that is a problem. So yes, most of our reserves, almost all of them, I think 99% of our reserves are in the oil sands. So that's the downside. It is more carbon intense. I want people to know, though, that all heavy oil is intense, or is carbon intense. So the heavy oil in California, the heavy oil in Venezuela, heavy oil will always be more carbon intense. But there are some things that we absolutely need heavy oil from. Heavy oil and light oil, or sweet and sour, or are not exactly the same. Refineries need a combination of both. They have different hydrocarbon chemical components, and we need both of them. And so you can't just replace all shale with all oil sands, or vice versa. And in fact, as we go forward and use hydrocarbons and oil more for materials, when we do start, stop burning them and using them for chemicals and that kind of thing, asphalt, coatings, all the things around your living room that are made of plastic, heavy oil has a lot of advantages. Actually, there's a lot of things that you can use heavy oil for that can't be replaced otherwise. So so that's the question. How do we make sure that we retain Canadian share production, that we don't let OPEC take over the market, that as American production declines, there's still some safe Western OECD sources of oil, and not have that horrible carbon intensity, is through carbon capture. And so the oil sands major companies have a $75 billion plan. That's already going through the regulatory process. I think they'll spend, $25 billion by 2030. And the negative aspects of the oil sands is also a positive aspect, in that they're quite concentrated, that there's about a dozen facilities that produce almost all those, 3.5 million barrels a day. And that makes it a little bit easier to capture the carbon, because they are concentrated, and you can store it in the same way. So So the same disadvantages that it has in carbon intensity makes it easier and more economical actually to capture that carbon. So that's what we're working on, how to make the
$75 billion. That's a little bit of money.
So much money. It's so much money. And that's why if you hear that, that they would like the federal government to chip in their share, that's why it is. But they got tens of billions of dollars already planning on the books, hoping the feds come in with some support, because it's a public good really to reduce that. But is it, doesn't make sense. You say it's $75 billion. Last year, the oil and gas sector contributed $50 billion in royalties and taxes. And so Canada is very wealthy off its, so in 2 years you'd pay for it and you'd have basically, almost carbon neutral oil. So yes, thinking of producing this for the next few decades. Everyone agrees. Mark Carney said it this week. We're going to need oil for decades. If we can carbon capture in the oil sands, and we'll be sitting in pretty good shape. We want to be that last barrel.
We're chatting tonight about is Alberta oil ethical with Heather Exner-Pirot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a fun chat tonight with Heather Exner-Pirot of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, because I like trying to challenge her, and I just am doing a terrible job at it because she's so smart and so knowledgeable about what's going on in numerous different sectors. And tonight we're talking about the oil industry. We may talk about small nuclear reactors later on. She's also very knowledgeable about Indigenous issues and critical minerals and probably Alberta politics, which I'd love to chat with you about either tonight or sometime. But let me come back to your article, which I found really kind of interesting, about is Alberta oil ethical. You make the argument, and I think it's worth underlining, that if we don't export Alberta oil, the oil still will be exported, but by authoritarian regimes.
Yeah, so there's part of that. OPEC just made cuts. So how come OPEC made cuts 2 weeks ago? First of all, they want oil to be $100 a barrel. In their minds, there's a floor on the price that they think it's worth. But how come they haven't done that in the last 6 or 7 years? Is because if they cut, the Americans would just increase production. And so their cut would be for naught, essentially. And so now they are noticing that they can control the market a little bit better, that the Americans cannot ramp up production as they've been doing since about 2012, 2013, that they don't have the ability to do it anymore, that their best days are starting to be behind them, even though they're still tremendous producers, but they cannot grow like they've been growing before, and they will soon plateau, and they will soon decline on the oil side, not natural gas. And so OPEC is emboldened, Russia is emboldened, and so we do need, what we need to look at is how much of the global oil market do we want the OPEC to control? And right now it's about a third. And everyone assumes that it's going to grow and grow and grow, because Western companies have faced the divestment. It's been harder in Western countries to get regulatory approval. And so as their market share grows, they will have more monopoly, more weight, more power. And that is the scary part. And we've seen this story before in the 1970s, when OPEC can increase or decrease production. Everyone's kind of at their whim. It's very destabilizing. In fact, the International Energy Agency was created exactly as a counterweight to OPEC, for all the energy importers, the Western energy importers, to have some balance, to be able to plan and coordinate on their side, for example, through strategic petroleum reserves. So what I'm watching for is how much market share do we really want OPEC to have? I don't think it's arguable that, more is bad. And so making sure that there's secure Western supplies of this fundamental commodity that we cannot live without.
You make the argument in your article that the International Energy Agency and other people are suggesting that to achieve what we want to achieve from a climate change standpoint, oil usage has got to go down by like 75%. We got to use 1/4 of what we're currently using. Is that really possible? And how does that change your analysis?
So when people say, oil is on decline anyways, look at the scenarios, we're going to need, like you say, 70% less, but whatever the IEA scenario is. But those are scenarios. That's what would we need to do to get to, for example, our 2050 goal. It's not a forecast. And all the forecasts actually see oil demand growing into the next decade, and then likely plateauing, not declining, not plateauing. What I want to iterate for everyone is that other than whale oil, we have never, as humans, as civilizations, cut down on our use of our major energy sources. We use more coal today than we've ever used. We use more wood and biomass today than we've ever used. It's a much smaller share of our energy mix, but we're just using so much more energy that the absolute amount of biomass that we're burning for energy is at the highest ever. So
hold it. You're with everything we've done with coal, you're saying we're actually burning more coal today, and we're burning more wood? That's not in North America. It's got to be somewhere else.
It's somewhere else. That's exactly the point, Brian. If we said, oh, Europe is cutting, we're getting EVs, Norway has great EVs, Canada, we have an EV mandate, United States, everything's looking good. That's 1 billion of us, including Japan. If you include the EU, US, Canada, Japan, South Korea, that's 1 billion of us. What about the other 7 billion? They need to consume, they will consume more energy. And if we don't provide, if clean energy is not cheaper than oil and coal, they will use oil and coal. Not because they like dirty energy, but because for them, it's a choice between dirty or no energy. And that choice now is dung and biomass, cutting wood. They're cutting forests down in Poland because of the price of natural gas, because of the Russian war. So it's not even an African, some, imaginary third world. It's Europe right now.
Seriously, they're cutting down forests to burn for heat.
Yes, look it up. Everyone look it up. And globally, we've never had 8 billion people and growing before. So no, we've never used so much biomass. We've never used so much coal, even though as a percentage, they have been reduced in the mix. The absolute amount is still the highest. So this is why I don't, and people say, oh, what about wind and solar? Wind and solar are getting so cheap, and that's debatable. But what I want to point out is that wind and solar produce electricity. And electricity is only about 20-25% of our energy use anyways. In Canada, I think it's 24%. Of all the energy we use, only 24% is electricity. The rest is heat and transportation fuels. And solar and wind don't provide heat and transportation.
But we're all going to be driving electric cars in the next year or two.
Okay. I wish we would. I wish we were. I'll tell you why we're not. The mines don't exist in the world. The mines don't even exist for all of our EV mandates, for all of our transmission, electrify the grid, battery storage ideas. The mines don't exist. And I'd like to say this, all the time to highlight this for people. We aren't, the IEA says we need 6 times more, minerals, metals to have the energy transition, the copper, the nickel, the manganese, the zinc, all those things, lithium, 6 times more than what we have today. Some of them you need 10 times more, depending on the metal. Some you need 3 times more, depending on the metal, but overall 6 times. We aren't even at 1 times what we were in 2012. We are investing 30% less today than we were investing in 2012 in the mining industry.
In Canada or worldwide?
Worldwide. Canada is almost a perfect mirror of it. We're not better or worse. The last boom, commodities boom, peaked in 2012, and we have not yet achieved the same amount of capital expenditures, not to mention inflation, compounded on that.
There's such, huge demand for these critical minerals. Why aren't we?
Well, the question to that, or the answer to that, Brian, is economics. If renewables and batteries and EVs were cheaper than oil and coal and gas, we would be. But because metals are expensive and because that industry is volatile, if people had to rely on Canadian metals and the cost that we can produce them on for the energy, they would not be able to afford energy. And that is the sad fact, is coal is cheaper and more accessible. And if we can't replace it with something cheaper, people will not use it. Right now, renewables, batteries are not cheaper.
You make another interesting argument in your article. You're talking about that there's 1.3 trillion liters of tailings waste and growing inventory of thousands of abandoned well sites. And so you're saying effectively because of that looming liability in the future, we need, and that's just in Alberta, I presume, we need to keep Alberta oil and gas companies profitable so that they can take care of their waste. Is that correct?
Well, so it was a dialogue. So that's what the other person pointed out, those true facts. So it wasn't me that pointed it out, but it is a true fact that we do have those tailings, we do have that waste. And that is an argument often to say, oh, we're unethical. And I will say that those are an issue, but all mining has tailings, all oil sands has tailings, all industrial activity has, and that we're pretty well regulated in Canada. There's obviously been some stories in the media, the Imperial oil spill, which didn't harm, by the way, there's no evidence it harmed any wildlife, certainly didn't affect human drinking water, but obviously is environmentally, a huge fail. So not to diminish that, but yes, I don't know what the argument there is that we do need to deal with those things. So we better have the money to deal with them. So if you just stopped and cut it off all today, how would you deal with it? They would just be abandoned, I guess. So yes, I think there was the plan that the oil sands would last so many decades. They have reserves for 2 or 3 more decades, much longer, actually, if they invested some more capital. And over that time, as they get closer to the end of their lifespan, they will start to remediate. I think we can have an honest conversation of, is there enough liability? Is there enough security for some of those liabilities? And that's a fair conversation to have. But it's not a matter of, should we just stop it altogether?
So I think that the argument that you were having with this other individual from the Pembimbia Institute was, can you balance environmental issues and energy issues and the economic benefits of those energy issues? What do you think?
Well, so this is where the conversation needs to go. And I absolutely believe in climate change. I absolutely think that, it's a detriment, needs to be addressed, that, let's spend $75 billion on carbon capture, which works out to be about $15 a barrel. So if you just added a premium to our Canadian barrel of $15, we would be as clean as anyone, but socially more responsible. So it's expensive, but it's definitely not, out in kind of fantasy land. So what was the question again, Brian?
Can you balance
right,
pollution and jobs? Can you balance climate change and economic development? I
get it.
And what you argue is that, which I think is interesting for people in Ontario to hear, what you argue in your article is that Albertans are really in the middle of that, and they are balancing, that they're not just ship oil, and they're not climate change is the number one issue, and we have to shut down oil and gas. They really are in the middle. And you and I've chatted about this before. I've spent some time out in Edmonton and Fort McMurray recently, and I was expecting, based on sort of media in Toronto, that I would meet a whole bunch of climate change deniers, and I didn't. I met a whole bunch of people that were really quite interested in hydrogen and carbon capture and sequestering and other ways of reducing the carbon footprint that the oil and gas industry had.
Yeah, great points. Thank you for raising that. So what we're calling it now is the trilemma, and it was always there, the trilemma of affordability, reliability, and sustainability. And it is absolutely the case for the last 100 years, 1,000 years, whatever. We only focused on the affordability and the reliability and didn't think too much about sustainability. So that part is new. That was an oversight. We need to address it. But it is also wrong to say the only thing that matters is sustainability. The only thing that matters is greenhouse gas emissions. Because at the end of the day, people do need energy to survive. So if you, like I say it it's provocative, but if you got rid of oil tomorrow, just imagine your life in your city, how would you get food? How would you heat things? Billions of us would die in a couple of months, a couple of years. You cannot have 8 billion people without oil. It is not possible today. And so to think about what are the implications of divesting, of cutting off fossil fuel investment today before we have equally cheap sources, equally reliable and affordable sources, is that millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people descend into energy poverty. And that was actually, there's an article in Nature, which many of the environmentalists like to point out to, very, very well-regarded journal from February, and you can look it up, on the impacts of the last year's energy crisis on poor households. And that, above, kind of gives a range, but somewhere in the neighborhood of 100, 120 million people move down into extreme poverty. In fact, if you look at the World Bank and their measures of poverty, more people moved into extreme poverty last year than in any year since we started calculating this since World War II. Last year was the worst year for the number of people moving into extreme poverty that we've ever seen. And part of it was COVID, part of it was the energy crisis, part of it was the commodity shock from the Ukraine war and the impact that had on the cost of food. So how that is not a top story, I do not know, but I can tell you that energy crisis equals energy poverty equals people in extreme poverty.
Interesting conversation tonight with Heather Exner-Pirot. We're going to take a break for some messages and be back in just 2 minutes chatting about is Alberta oil ethical? Interesting. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. Our issue tonight is Alberta oil ethical? And our guest is Heather Exner-Pirot, who is with the Macdonald Laurier Institute and has written an article recently arguing that Alberta oil is not only ethical, but it's completely important and necessary and critical for the 8 billion people in this world. You've got this interesting article, this interesting paragraph. It was a really interesting article, but this interesting paragraph where you speak about some of the transformative investments in net zero petrochemicals and blue hydrogen in Alberta over the past 2 years. I want to list some of these, and I want you to chat a little bit about what you think is happening, if you could. 1.6 billion hydrogen air products complex in Edmonton, a 2.5 billion carbon neutral ammonia and methanol production facility in Grand Prairie, a 10 billion investment by Dow to triple the size of its current petrochemical facility in Fort Saskatchewan, and you go on. What's going on?
So again, we need hydrocarbons for not just driving our cars and gasoline and diesel, but we need it for a lot of materials. And I think in the future we will stop, hopefully soon, stop burning, these materials, but we will never stop needing hydrocarbons for some of the essentials of life, these chemicals, and also think about blue hydrogen, which is hydrogen with the carbon capture. So what is happening is that Alberta and Western Canada, through the Western Sedimentary Basin, through the Montney, and the fracking and the horizontal drilling, has probably the cheapest natural gas in the world. And it's the cheapest because it's hard for us to get it to anyone that's, willing to pay for it because we don't have any LNG export capacity. But nonetheless, if you're in Alberta or Northeast BC, you can have access to cheap natural gas. And so that is a very excellent feedstock. So is the oil sands and the bitumen, excellent feedstock for a lot of the chemicals that we need to produce things. And so again, Alberta has been blessed with this incredible endowment of hydrocarbons. And alongside that is incredible geology for sequestering carbon. You can't sequester carbon everywhere. It's not safe, and there isn't the kind of geological storage, the pore space to sequester it everywhere. So not only do we have the cheap feedstock, but now we're investing in carbon capture, and we have almost unlimited, ability to sequester it in the ground. And so if you're a Dow, world's largest chemical company, and you have your own net zero goals and you have your own ESG goals, where can you go to produce it at a reasonable cost when you're looking for net zero too? And that is what Alberta is offering through all the investments in the carbon capture that the Alberta government is investing in, that the federal government has supported, that the oil sands are supporting. You can, go do your in the industrial heartland there, and there's a capacity and a mechanism to sequester the carbon from your operation. Cement is next, fertilizer, these what we call hard to abate industries that require a lot of industrial heat that have to come from fossil fuels, can't come from electricity or require it as a feedstock. And so another advantage, and again, the federal government has supported a lot of those investments that you just listed. And so there is a way forward where we can, we need these things. We want them to be net zero. Alberta has a great carbon tech industry. The federal government is supporting it. There's good things happening. We all want the same things here. So, instead of focusing on the negative, I just wanted to highlight we are diversifying. We are looking to net zero by 2050. We are doing our part. It's attracting investment. Check. It's all happening.
Another interesting argument you make is that our operating costs in Alberta are actually reasonably low, $12.50 a barrel, you say, and the upfront investment has already been made, and that you also then argue that royalties are going to go up. Explain all that, if you could.
Okay, so sometimes an argument made against the oil sands, is the first to go. People is that it is an expensive barrels produced, regardless of the carbon intensity. It is more expensive to produce a barrel of oil sands than, you know, kind of a Saudi where it's a very light, sweet, you know, created and kind of pops up. So but the fact is that the oil sands are mostly like mines. So the investment has been made. This is what I want to iterate. The investment has been made in the last 10, 20 years. And now the oil sands require the littlest capital expenditure, the littlest CapEx, sustaining CapEx to keep going. So whereas, you know, in the Permian Basin where you have to, you know, make a, you know, do an exploration, get a lease, you know, drill a new well, and a couple of years you have to do it all over again. And the oil sands, when you build these things, now you got 10, 20, 30 years ahead of you of just slowly, you know, going through the process, grabbing the bitumen, separating it. So such the point that our upstream costs are $12.50 a barrel. And so, and then you have your pipeline costs, but I think at, you know, around $35 a barrel for a lot of these companies, they're break even. And on top of that is the gravy. Why is that great for Albertans and Canadians? I already mentioned last year that, you know, $50 billion was paid by the sector. The government made a deal, knowing that it was high upfront cost to attract that investment. They said, you're not going to hardly pay any royalties. I think is 1 or 2 or 3%. I don't have the number in front of me, but very low royalties until you've reached what they call payout, until you've paid off a certain point of that very high, you know, multi-billion-dollar investment that you made. Well, guess what? 2022, almost all those companies hit payout. And that means that the royalty rate is now, you know, an order of magnitude higher. And that means that in a good year, 2015, and last time oil was super high, 2014, whereas they might have made a couple billion, I think, in their best year, 5 or 6 billion in their best year of royalties. Now we're looking at 18, 20, $22 billion a year in oil royalties. So a very, you know, if you're looking at Alberta politics and Danielle Smith and Rachel Notley are promising this, promising that, it's because they're getting so much more. It's built in that they're going to get more oil revenues from now until, you know, decades to come.
The argument that this individual, Janetta McKenzie, who responded to you is effectively that demand is going to go down, I guess. Is that it?
Yes, it's the assumption that demand is going to go down. And so that's where I say, you know, where I disagree the most. I agree on climate change. I agree that we need to diversify. I agree we want to capture the carbon. Where I disagree is that demand is going to go down for those reasons I mentioned to you before. We're 8 billion people. We're soon going to be 9 billion people. 7 billion people are still moving up into the middle class, still wanting to burn more, even as Europe and Canada and Japan and the United States tampers down our consumption. And that we are going to need all hands on deck, all energy sources, the solar, the wind, the nuclear, frankly, the coal, hopefully abated coal, the natural gas, hopefully abated natural gas. We are going to need every source of energy that we have to meet that growing population. And so, yeah, so I don't foresee, I say I'll put my own money onto it. I put my own money into it. I don't see demand going down.
She argues that solar has declined in cost by 85% since 2010, and in some places is the cheapest electricity you've got. The prices of electrical vehicles are shrinking, and that they could reach cost parity with gasoline cars by 2026 in only 3 years.
Again, why I disagree. It's not what do I want that to happen or not. Yeah, I looked into getting an EV for my daughter. Too expensive, couldn't get them, took a year to get them. There are not the mines in the world for the metals that we need. We're going to hit a wall on copper right away. Everyone pay attention to that. Google it, look it up. We're going to hit a wall on copper. There's no energy transition. There's no electrification of everything without copper. I can, metal after metal. Do people know that in Canada, we produce less battery metals today than we did in 2019? We produce less battery metals in Canada today than we did in 2019. Go look it up. Natural Resources Canada, their annual inventory just came out last month. So the mines don't exist. The investment is not going into mining to do all the electrification, to do all the batteries, to do all the EVs that people are talking about.
I just interviewed someone on ESG, someone that, like you, has a real knowledge in Indigenous affairs, worked across Canada, has worked in Fort McMurray. And she said that we are at risk of runaway climate change. And this kind of
it's climate change is an issue. And what I don't want to do is diminish climate change. I think we shouldn't, that's what, I can't wait to talk about nuclear, because for me, that is the most logical solution to all these things. But carbon capture and nuclear, those are the methods. And it is, for me though, it is not an option to say, well, let's stop producing oil. Do you know why? Because hundreds of millions of people will be in extreme poverty if oil is above $100. That is a true fact. And so how do we balance these? What is the lesser of the evils? And for me, I think extreme poverty, across much of the world is hard to deal with. And 1 degree of warming is maybe an easier challenge to adapt to mitigate than cutting off our main source of energy. That's what I honestly believe. The cost benefit analysis is to have a transition that is orderly, that still provides energy for everyone, not a chaotic, we're in a crisis, urgent, stop everything kind of a situation.
Okay, so you've wanted to chat about nuclear. Tell me about small nuclear reactors.
Small modular reactors. So, one reason I want to talk about it this week is because nuclear had some bad luck and some bad press. We obviously know about Chernobyl, about 3 Mile Island, and then Fukushima. I think that was 2012. Might have been 2011, but I think it was 2012. And after 2012, after Fukushima, Germany in particular, Germany and Japan said, okay, we're cutting off nuclear. Germany obviously did it, in the last couple of weeks, ended its last nuclear plant. And nuclear had a real bad run. And yet, outside of the Western world, China was still building up, India was still building up, Russia was still building. Outside of the Western world, people still saw the use and utility of it. And now the energy, the energy trilemma, the energy crisis hit Europe last year. And we know we need to get off coal and gas. We know that solar and wind are intermittent. So what is the solution? The only low carbon solution is nuclear. And so nuclear is absolutely having a renaissance. Where there's been dozens of reactors announced in the last few years, and there's new innovation in tech for the first time. So people say nuclear is expensive, it's unsafe. A solution to that is small modular reactors. They become cheaper because they're modularized, and you can make them more in a production facility and then assemble them somewhere else. So you kind of get, that Fordization of, the modularization of it, the efficiencies. And because they're smaller, they don't carry the same load if something were to happen. And a lot of these Gen 4 SMRs, we call them, the laws of physics dictate that they can't melt down. They are inherently safe. They cannot melt down like we saw Chernobyl do. So, humans are smart. Since 1984, we've come up with a few new things on nuclear, and now we're implementing it. So that's why SMRs are so positive. Now, what's the public opinion on that? Before Russia, Ukraine, and that energy crisis, it was pretty mixed in the West. Since then, there's been a lot of public opinion polling. Everywhere, public acceptance of nuclear is going up, not least in Canada, where pretty much outside of Quebec, everyone is in favor. Majorities are in favor of nuclear. And of course, in Ontario, you're the beneficiaries of this incredible low carbon source, and are getting the first SMR in Canada, I think at Darlington. So a year ago, Stephen Guilbeault, ECCC, Environment Climate Change Canada, announced their green bonds program. And they said, renewables, all these things, you can invest money in, batteries, but not these things: fossil fuels, arms manufacturing, gambling, alcohol, and nuclear. It was like on this total sin list, things that are very bad, things that we will not fund. And nuclear found its way on that list. And the nuclear industry was like, what is this? What have we done? We offer this, excellent low carbon source of electricity. Why are you doing this to us? So last week, why I bring this all up? Last week, Justin Trudeau, when he was in New York, had an interview, said a lot of other things. But one thing he said was, with the German president right beside him, Germany just closed their last nuclear plants 2 weeks ago, said that nuclear is absolutely necessary. Canada is investing in it. We are supporting it. We are full blown behind nuclear. And the fact is, the Liberals are doing a really good job on nuclear. That since that terrible green bonds, sin list that they put out since last summer, they have been making investments in small modular reactors. They have been helping the supply chain. They have been incentivizing it. They have been working with the Americans Department of Energy to create some North American integration. And at the G7 energy and climate meetings in Japan last month, joined an alliance of 5 countries, Italy and Germany, set it out on improving the nuclear supply chain and getting Russia out of Western nuclear supply chains. So lots of great, exciting things happening on the geopolitical side as well as the climate side on nuclear.
Okay, sounds good. Heather Exner-Pirot, I really appreciate it. We're going to take a final break and come back with some concluding comments. And I'm going to ask her about Alberta politics in just 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a real pleasure for me tonight to be chatting with Heather Exner-Pirot. She wrote this really interesting article about, is Alberta oil ethical? And we've been chatting about that. We've been talking about climate change. We've been talking about the oil sands. We've been talking about small nuclear modular reactors. But I got to take this opportunity, Heather, to ask you about what's going on in your election. Is Alberta going to separate? Are they going to vote for a separatist government?
Well, not anytime soon. There isn't the popular will or demand for that. I will say, economically, there might be some good reasons why Alberta might be better off on her own, just like Norway never joined the EU. But that is not the sentiment. I think Albertans are generally proud Canadians, want to be part of the union, want to have a place in it. Where they don't feel like the redheaded stepchild all the time. But that is a separate question of, are they going to vote for Danielle Smith and the UCP? And so it's a nail biter. It's much closer than it should be, or that anyone thought it would be. This is a true blue conservative province. Had their dalliance with the NDP already. Economically, people didn't feel it go well. But here, Danielle Smith has made so many own goals, that it's looking pretty clse.
So I'm told that Edmonton is going to go NDP, that the rural parts of Alberta are going to go UCP, and that it's really up to Calgary, where you live. What do you think is going to happen?
So everyone around here, and this is my first Alberta election. I moved here from Saskatchewan 3.5 years ago. So this is my first time I get to cast my ballot in Alberta. Everyone around here calls Edmonton Redmonton. They think, they're the socialist commies up there in government town. So that's kind of a funny thing. Pretty blue collar town, actually. But anyways, but it's all, very, very reliably NDP orange in this province. And then, of course, rural Alberta, there's, they can only go right. They can't go middle. They'll only go right. So it does come down to Calgary. And so with all that oil money, I said that the governments have to throw around, the UCP government is kind of moving away from its conservative roots, libertarian roots, and throwing some of its money around. So just recently said, okay, we will pay for the new Calgary Flames Stadium. We're going to make that happen. And today announced, what would otherwise be considered a pretty progressive tax cut for people who make less than $60,000 a year. It will cost a lot of money, but it'll be a very low tax rate for those lower income Albertans. So really trying to attract the poor area of Calgary is the northeast corner. And that's where the most, where it could go either way. Really pulling out all the stops to attract that particular segment of the vote. It's like Florida. It's like Florida in northeast Calgary. You just don't know where it's going to go.
I interviewed a chief economist of an Alberta-based financial institution the other day, and he was saying that that the description of the Alberta NDP as socialist or NDP is completely wrong. He said their policies are more in line with the Federal Liberal Party, and maybe even a right wing of the Federal Liberal Party, a very sort of centrist party. Is that fair?
It's fair. So, probably because I'm out here saying I love Alberta oil and how great it is, I think I'm moderate, again, socially liberal, fiscally conservative. It's a tough choice. But I think Rachel Notley governed pretty well from the center. And being from Saskatchewan, Roy Romano and the NDP absolutely did too, found that sweet spot. And so I think that is a fair assessment that Rachel Notley is not a socialist, that Rachel Notley governs from the center. But the worry from the small C conservatives like myself, is that the rest of her caucus isn't. That there's a lot of people in her caucus that, kind of represent identity politics and are against, oil. And so it's that fundamental, Rachel might be okay, but the NDP is not. I think that is the main worry of those who are still on the fence.
But then what I heard from this gentleman and what I've heard from some people is that, a similar argument could be made about some of the caucus of Danielle Smith's party, is that they're extremely right-wing, extremist, social conservatives, that a lot of people that believe in women's right to choose, gay marriage, etc., would feel very uncomfortable with.
Yeah. So on the women's right to choose, I don't want to debate all these things, and I certainly don't want to be in the position of defending the UCP or Danielle Smith. I will say that that's absolutely fair. And that's why it has come to be that in Alberta, it's a 48-52 split, because people are not comfortable, especially in Calgary, especially in Edmonton, but also in Calgary, with some of those more ideologically right-wing positions, the socially conservative side of the UCP. So that is why we're stuck, in this of this, no one knows what will happen in 28 days, but something will happen.
Whichever way it goes, does this have an impact on the rest of Canada?
I mean, to the extent that you care.
Of course we care, but does a Torontonian get impacted about whether it's Rachel Notley or Danielle Smith?
I think, yeah. Okay. If I was a liberal voting Torontonian, I think I would rather have an NDP Alberta government, that there would probably be less friction with the federal Liberals, for sure. So from that perspective of, a unified Canada, not throwing out all these, bombs all the time, yes, a Rachel Notley government would be superior. For the average Albertan, I think it's really an economic question. And if our oil can't, be maximized, that will affect Canada too. If we can't produce as much oil and gas as the world needs, then there'll be less transfers for everyone else. So it's a hard question, but I think politically, NDP is much more aligned with Toronto politics. Absolutely.
Heather Exner-Pirot, thank you so much for joining us and telling us that Alberta oil is ethical, that small nuclear modular reactors are not only ethical but needed, and that both of the parties are reasonable, and both of the potential premiers are reasonable, and it's going to come down to a very small difference between the two and who ends up winning. We're going to have you back sometime in the last week of the campaign to hear what you got to say. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Talk to you later.
That's our show for tonight. Everybody, thank you so much for joining us. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 9:60 a.m. saga960.ca if you want to stream me online, even from Calgary. Good night, everybody.